Hi, in this tutorial I will be demonstrating how to build one of our kits. This information is meant to be generic and you should adapt these instructions to your particular kit. My goal is to show you common methods used during the build process of one of our kits, as well as some techniques that may be helpful in troubleshooting and finding common problems. It is important that you understand how the layout relates to the strip board. The layout shows a top view of the board with the copper strips facing down. You must pay careful attention to the cuts because they are also shown this way. For example, if you flip the board over with the copper strips facing upwards, then begin making your cuts according to the layout without first mirroring the layout, you will ruin your board. Before we get to cutting the strip board, let's take a look at the dimensions. I will note that you do not necessarily have to cut it, especially if you are using a large enclosure such as a 1590 BB. But it will make following the layout and fitting it into your enclosure easier. Your strip board layout has a given number of strips, sometimes referred to as tracks, and a given number of columns. To clarify terminology, we are calling strips the continuous copper strips on the board, and columns are the vertical rows of holes perpendicular to the strips. These dimensions are usually labeled on the Tagboard Effects layouts, but I recommend you counting them on the layout anyways in order to make sure you don't get them confused. If you cut the board too short, you'll need a new board. Carefully count out the strips and columns and mark them with a marker on the column and strip that you will be cutting. In other words, add 1 to the dimensions. For the layout that I'm using for this demonstration, it has 20 strips and 21 columns. Since the board has 21 strips, I won't bother cutting the 1 strip off. I will place my mark on the 22nd column. You should double check your count, which I have done here by counting the columns backwards from my mark. Once your board is marked, there are a few ways you can cut it. I commonly use a bandsaw, but that's not something everyone owns. So I'm using a simple method called scoring, where I use a utility knife to make grooves on both sides of the board. I have a scrap piece of wood underneath my board to keep from cutting up my bench top. Be careful not to cut yourself if you use this method. Take your time and score it well so it breaks correctly. The goal isn't to cut all the way through the board, but to make a weak point so the board will break apart only at that location. Another method I've been told about is using a Dremel or a similar rotary tool with a diamond cutoff wheel. You can use your creativity and find a method and tool that works best for you. Once you have finished scoring both sides of the board, place it on the edge of your bench or board, and you should be able to snap it apart with just a little bit of pressure. You can use a file or a piece of sandpaper to smooth the rough edges. Now you're finished with this part and ready to move on to making your cuts in the strips. You'll need to make cuts to your layout in order to break the electrical connectivity between different parts of the circuit. The cuts are usually indicated by the red squares in the layout. The layouts usually have an additional view of the board without any components on it, so you can clearly see where the cuts are. Sometimes components are mounted over the cuts, so you might not see them in the component layout view. Remember, the layout is a top view of the board, so you'll need to mirror it when making the cuts to the strips. To cut the strips, you can use whatever method works best for you. Some people choose to drill all the way through the board, while others cut just enough to sever the strip. As far as what tool to use, you can use whatever tool works best for you. There's even a special tool made just for cutting the strips. I found the tip of a sharp bit, such as a 7/64 inch or a 1/8 inch drill bit, or even the tip of a step bit works great. I am making the cuts by hand in this video. If you have many cuts to make, you might want to use something to hold the bit. Otherwise, you may end up with a blister on your finger from twisting the bit. I'm using a lead wire of a resistor to poke through and identify the hole from the bottom side. I then use a marker to mark it so I don't accidentally cut it the wrong place. I recommend counting at least twice. A cut in the wrong place will really mess things up and possibly ruin the board. For the rest of my cuts, I'm counting them backwards from the layout, but I don't recommend this since it's easy to get confused and make a mistake. Take your time and check your cuts. Make sure there is no copper still connected between the strips. The tiniest amount will still form a connection and can be very difficult to find later. When you're finished, you should count the cuts and compare them to the number of cuts in the layout to make sure that you haven't missed one. Once you finish making your cuts, it's time to add your jumper wires. Make sure you keep the orientation of the board correct and don't flip it the wrong way.